Morning, everyone. My name's Llewellyn Hughes. I'm the director of the ANU Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions, or ICEDS, here at the ANU. I wanted to begin by acknowledging the Ngunnawal people whose lands we're meeting on today, and also to acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are here today in person, who are listening in online. So welcome to the ANU Climate Update. This event is held annually, and it's designed to bring people together across communities and indeed across borders. We've got a large number of people listening in online in order to explore the recent climate science and also to think about the implications for our region, for ourselves, and importantly also to think about solutions and action. The climate update this year is taking place at the end of another summer, which has been marked by extended heat waves, by severe bushfires, and by floods. I actually last month was hiking in Mount Kosciuszko, and I was thinking about putting the picture up of the striking skies that you saw around the area because of bushfires that were occurring just to the west of Perisher, where we were located. And of course, we had the conversations that many people have been having around Australia about whether to stay or to go and so on, particularly down on the Great Ocean Road, around Lorne and areas like that. So for this year, we wanted to provide an update on the state of the climate, of course, but also to highlight work that's being done here at the ANU, and also is being done with partners and by our partners in order to think about mechanisms to enable adaptation, while also recognizing, of course, that climate mitigation is our first and best response always. So we're delighted to be able to talk in some sessions that we're having later today, in sessions 2 and 3, both about technology solutions to the adaptation problem using satellite technology, and also to think about local community responses and human responses to solving the adaptation problem. And of course, that follows on from the release of the National Adaptation Plan by the federal government for the first time towards the end of last year. And that's a large piece of work that's in front of us over this year and over the coming years to think about how we can better implement climate adaptation in an integrated and in a joined-up way. A really important conversation for us moving forward, I think, and it's something that we at ICEDS will be spending a lot of time thinking about over the coming weeks and months. So to that end, we're really lucky today, I think, to have the opportunity to hear from some of the brightest minds in climate research and also in adaptation, here from the university, and also, as I mentioned, from our partners. So today's event includes 3 sessions. In the first session, as usual, we'll provide the annual update, which covers information on the latest climate data and what that means for Australia and for the world. And we're really fortunate to be able to welcome Professor Sarah Perkins-Kirkpatrick, who many of you will have seen in the media in recent weeks and months, and whose work on heat waves and human health has been helping to shape the conversation globally. After providing that climate update, Sarah is going to be joined by Emeritus Professor Mark Howden, who we're delighted to welcome back to ICEDS and to the climate update. Mark is the inaugural director of ICEDS, and I was in this role prior to myself. So thanks so much for coming, Mark. Very much appreciate it. And there will also be ample opportunity for questions, both from the floor and also from folk who are listening in online. The second session is going to explore aerial technology and how it can be used to anticipate and also to manage climate risk. And we're delighted to be hearing from Associate Professor Johanna Nalau from Griffith University, and also from Professor Anna Moore from the Institute for Space here at the ANU, which works across the whole space ecosystem in partnership with industry, with governments, with academia, and with communities to think about the use of space technologies, including in relation to climate change. So after that session, there'll be a short break for morning tea. And then in the final session, we're going to come back to the ground in order to think about the realities of translating research and policy into action, and particularly what that means at the local and at the community level. I'm particularly looking forward to this discussion. Actually, in late December last year, we had a workshop with a number of different organizations, individuals from government, from civil society, from First Nations groups, as well as from the research community, to think about what the agenda really looks like for adaptation planning moving forward, given the National Adaptation Plan and how it's been released. And it's absolutely clear from that there's a lot of interest and energy, but also a lot of need to think about the implementation problem as it relates to adaptation. That discussion is going to be led by Associate Professor Jo Mummery from the University of Canberra. And Jo is going to be joined by Nicole Mitchell, who's the branch head of DECU's National Adaptation Policy Branch, as well as by Jenny Edwards, who's the lead science at Lighthouse Architecture, which is working with local communities in order to retrofit homes in order to make them more climate resilient. So there's really a kind of, in today's event, the big picture in terms of climate science, technology picture, and also the local picture in terms of adaptation planning. So let me stop there. Just a little housekeeping. First of all, noting that today's event, as I've alluded to, is hybrid, and the event is also being recorded. As I noted, we encourage, of course, questions in each of our sessions. We have someone, Amellina, who is going to monitor the Q&A function within Zoom for those who are listening in online. So please put your questions in there and they'll be relayed to the speakers in due course. Just like the movie theater, for those of you who are here, please check your phones, make sure that you are on silent or have your phone turned off. I think I did that from my end as well. It'd be embarrassing if it rang right now. And also for those who are here in line, some of you may have found them, but the bathrooms are just out here. There are signs available, so please make use of those as you need. So let me introduce Professor Sarah Perkins-Kirkpatrick to you to deliver the 2026 climate update. As I said, many of you will have seen Sarah in the media, print media, and also on TV. Sarah is a professor of climate science at the Fenner School of Environment and Society here at the ANU. And she, over the course of her career, has worked particularly on climate extremes with a particular focus on heat waves and their projections in physical climate models. Sarah is also interested in looking at what drives them and how they might change in the future, and has a side business, if I could call it that, in extreme event attribution, which has also been garnering a lot of national media as well. So let me introduce Sarah. Thanks.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. So I'll just jump right to it. When I was preparing this talk, I will start off by saying that, a bit of a spoiler alert, there's not a whole lot of good news in this talk, I'm afraid to say, but that's probably not all that much of a surprise to most of us here today. And when I was preparing this particular slide, I was looking for an AI image about the apocalypse post-climate change. And what I actually found was this image from 2019 up near Foster. So this was our Black Summer where we had those catastrophic bushfires. And seeing this photo, knowing that it's real, I feel is a really poignant reminder of what we're facing. If you can't see it clearly, there's two young children literally looking in the face of these bushfires. And to me, given what's going on currently and how things have changed, this is a very real future for us. And I don't like saying that. It really is a hard thing to say. But unfortunately, given what the latest climate data is telling us, this is, a likely direction for us. Okay, so to start off at the global scale, looking back at 2025, this was our third hottest year on record. with the last 3 years being the top 3 hottest years on record. Now, if we took the average of these 3 years, they would all be over, that average, would all be over the 1.5 degrees Celsius mark relative to a pre-industrial climate. And this is really concerning, for want of a better word, because this 1.5 degree threshold was the lower limit set out in the Paris Agreement in 2015. Here we wanted to limit climate change to well below 2 degrees Celsius, but preferably 1.5. And the data just keeps on coming in that although we may not be permanently over that threshold, we are well on our way to be. So we're not doing enough quick enough. Now, 2024 still currently stands out as our hottest year on record. However, in 2024, we did have a global El Nino that helped boost those temperatures. So typically, or traditionally, an El Nino year often boosts not only Australian temperatures, but global temperatures. So we did see that in 2024, but we're still seeing 2023 and 2025 come very close behind without that boost from natural variability. So this figure originally was put together by the BBC in the UK, but was adapted by the Copernicus Climate Change Service in Europe. And what it's showing is the distribution of temperatures year on year between 1940 and 2025. And so as these distributions move further to the right and get a high colour of red, they're above the average temperature for that particular period. Now, back in the earlier years, they're all blue, they're below average relative to the entire period. As you move further in time, surprise, surprise, those temperatures become higher and more red. And 2025 was the first year that the entire distribution was above the average for that period. That didn't even happen in 2024. It almost did, but there were a few days where the temperature was technically below average. So this is the first year where we're being well above average relative to the same period. And on top of that, all months between 2023 to 2025 broke records. So each month has had its hottest month on record in the last 3 years, which is another really concerning and sobering statistic. So often when we talk about climate change in the media or to the general public or just in everyday conversation, we talk about global average temperature. And this is the temperature of the atmosphere taken around the entire world. But another way that we can measure how climate is changing is looking at the ocean heat content. So this is the extra heat that's building up in the entire global ocean. Now, this is actually a better way to measure climate change because it doesn't have the year-to-year variability we see in average temperature. It just goes virtually up and up and up. There's not that weather scale interaction that we tend to see with global average temperature, which often allows skeptics to jump in and say, oh, but climate change isn't happening because this year wasn't as hot. But with ocean heat content, that doesn't happen. It's much more stable in that way. And it's also important to remember that oceans absorb over 90% of the extra heat and extra energy caused by increasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So pretty much most of our extra energy by putting carbon in the atmosphere is going straight into the oceans. So that's why it can be also another more reliable measure to show how the climate is changing. And as you can see, it's been going up. It's been above average for the last 25 or so years. So looking at sea ice extent in the Arctic and Antarctic, in the summer, it was the 4th lowest for Antarctica and the 13th lowest for the Arctic. Now, that's in relative to their own season. So in the Antarctic, that's taken at March, and in the Arctic, it's taken in September. Winter ice extent was also the 3rd lowest in Antarctica and the lowest for the Arctic. So we're seeing these, slightly different statistics, but still they're up there with some of the larger values that we've seen. And for the another interesting and sobering statistic for the cryosphere is that Venezuela has now lost all its glaciers. So as global temperatures go up, we expect ice to melt. As the ice melts, we can absorb more energy into the climate system because we don't have that reflective surface, and the feedback amplifies itself, allowing temperatures to heat up faster. So again, this is just another sure sign that the climate is changing and changing more rapidly as time progresses. We're also seeing the cause of climate change, that is the increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide, go up and up year on year. So this figure comes from the Mauna Loa Observatory, which is where carbon dioxide is measured, or one of the places it's measured, but it's also been adapted by the UK Met Office to show firstly the projected forecast for last year. I couldn't find the actual statistic for 2025, and also where we need to be, what we need to do with atmospheric carbon if we want to stay at the 1.5 degrees threshold. Now, what you can see there is it kind of peaks in the next few years and has to start declining. Now, this is not from carbon dioxide coming out of the atmosphere naturally. That can take a very long time, on the order of hundreds of years. This would ultimately rely on technology pulling that carbon dioxide out. And that's something we just don't have at scale or at an affordable price just yet. Something to, I guess, be slightly happy about is that total emissions were slightly lower than 2024, and this is because of how the land sink was changing because we didn't have as many global forest fires, and also there was slight changes in deforestation. So we had slightly lower emissions. However, emissions from fossil fuels did increase 1% last year, which is, a sign that we're not doing as much as what we should. In terms of global politics, there is some good news. It seems that China's emissions have peaked. They roughly emit 1/3 of all the carbon dioxide globally. And there's no hard data yet that I could find, but it seems that over the last 18 months, their emissions haven't gone up. In fact, they've slightly decreased. So if they can stay on that trajectory, that is a good sign. The not so great is that COP30 didn't achieve much. We haven't really seen much being achieved by COP since 2015 with the Paris Agreement, which was just amazing. It's not to say that COPs aren't useful. We need to have these check-ins to see how we're going and hold us accountable. They're absolutely imperative, but it seems to be there is just so much hype and interest, which is a good thing. It can sometimes deter away from what we need to do, and we need to get the countries talking together and agreeing on what needs to be done and committing to things such as the 2035 targets that were put forward at COP. I could spend a whole talk talking about everything that's happened in the US over the last 12 months. But one thing I wanted to highlight is just basically the almost universal defunding of climate research. So the NCAR, the National Climate and Atmospheric Research Facility in Boulder, Colorado, is having its funding completely scrapped. This is absolutely detrimental. Trump is rolling back even regulations around pollution and not polluting through certain technologies. Even they are cutting back, let alone funding for renewable energy and EVs. So basically the whole gamut of things that things that were in place in the US to lower emissions and head towards a renewable energy future have virtually been scrapped. It's almost like he's taken a piece of coal, put it in his mouth and lit it up and smoked it. It's very, very bad what's happened. Although they're not the biggest polluter globally, they're right up there. So if they're doing this, there is a concern, I think, about what precedents it sets globally as well. Okay, so now locally. In Australia, it was announced earlier this week that we had our 4th warmest year on record. And our summer that we had last year, so 2024 going into 2025, was our 2nd warmest on record. Autumn was our 4th warmest. And winter was above average, but there were some cold anomalies in there. So I'm sure all the Canberrans remember how cold June was. It was absolutely freezing here. And in some parts, the minimum temperatures were below average in Australia for June. And this is because we had all of these cold fronts come through and then a high pressure following, which just meant that the cold air stayed put. And in some parts of Australia, the temperatures were the coldest, or the minimum temperatures, the nighttime temperatures were the coldest since 2017. So in the last 8 years, it's still not the coldest on record, but still colder than what we experienced in the last 8 or so years. And also the spring that we had last year was the 9th warmest on record. So you can see here that, yes, the average temperatures here in Australia are going up. And for large parts of Australia, the average temperature was in the top 10th percentile. Looking at sea surface temperatures, pretty much the same increase, more or less, except last year, sea surface temperatures in our region were the highest on record. So 7 months out of the 12 had their highest on record overall, and the other 5 were in the top 2 or top 3 of the highest on record. And across the region, when you look spatially, if you can see that map there, those average temperatures were in the top 10% of all years, so in the 90th percentile. So the oceans are heating up. That is affecting our local weather systems. And again, it's just another sure sign about how quickly the climate is changing. Now, interestingly, with rainfall in Australia, if you can see the figure there isn't a clear trend. Rainfall in Australia is highly variable. You probably don't need me to tell you that. And what's going on depends on where you are in Australia. So we are seeing declines in rainfall in southern Australia, particularly in winter. And during the wet season north, we're seeing increases. And this is virtually what happened last year as well. We had drier than normal conditions in the south and wetter than normal conditions in the north. But overall, when you average rainfall across Australia, there's not a long-term trend, but that's really what we expect because it's so highly variable and so regional that when you average out for that large area, it's not really going to show that change. Okay, so as Llewellyn touched on in the introduction, we have had a pretty extreme summer so far. We had 2 heat waves. The first one was between the 5th to 10th of January, and at the time it was considered our worst heat wave since 2019. So understandably, everyone was really concerned, really on edge, including myself. And because of the hot conditions and the drier than normal conditions down south, this paved the way for extreme fire danger, catastrophic fire danger in some areas as well. And there was a lot of fires in Victoria, burning well over 400,000 hectares. We saw a 25% increase in health emergencies in Melbourne. That was because of the heat, not the smoke. And we had an attribution study conducted on this particular event, the first on an Australian heatwave in about 10 years. And it was actually run by a group in the UK. I did contribute to this. But it's worth highlighting that we don't actually have an operational attribution service here in Australia. It's important, obviously, but we just don't have the capacity to do it in-house. So it was found that this event, surprise, surprise, was made more likely and hotter because of climate change. It's now increased in its frequency by 5 times, and the intensity was 1.6 degrees hotter because of human influence on the climate. And interestingly, this heatwave occurred when we saw flooding and high rainfall in Queensland. So that there was almost like this yin and yang effect between hot weather in the south and rainy weather in the north, which is not uncommon to a certain extent. Okay, our second heatwave towards the end of January. If I am honest, this is the heatwave that worried me the most because I was looking at the forecast and it was so long. In Canberra, it was about 8, maybe 9 days. And I actually felt really guilty during this heatwave because I had to go to London for an IPCC meeting, leaving my family behind. And I had many conversations with my husband about what would happen if there's a bushfire risk. He's a firefighter, so he's very well versed in what to do. But basically it was get out and run, go to your parents, leave. And I felt so guilty, thinking about what could happen. Thankfully, nothing happened this year, but this was certainly one that I was very concerned about simply by looking at the forecast. We saw over 50 records broken across Australia. Port Augusta reached 50 degrees Celsius. That is the highest temperature that far south. All state records broken in Victoria. Ski fields reached 30 degrees Celsius. Tuggeranong broke its record. The list goes on. It was a very intense and long heatwave, mainly in central southern Australia, but still one for the record books. And it's really a sign of what's to come. So I won't dwell on this slide too much. I just wanted to highlight that what we experienced this summer fits squarely in what we're seeing in the long-term changes in Australia, right? It's not exceptional in that way, but the trends that we're seeing are exceptional. We haven't released a new climate update report yet that comes out every 2 years. That will happen at the end of this year. But I don't expect the results to be much different. If anything, the trends will be stronger. So this year was very typical against long-term changes. Now, something that I've seen pop up a lot lately, and it's actually quite frustrating for a climate scientist, is apparently we're going to have an El Nino next summer. Now, something I want to make extremely clear to everyone listening is that it's far too early to have confidence in our ENSO predictions at this time of year. There is something called the autumn predictability barrier. But before autumn, we don't have much skill in predicting what will happen next summer. We've seen this before with La Niñas. Now, I know some services internationally are saying, yes, an El Nino is likely. And to be honest, the indicators are quite strong. But with confidence, we cannot say that El Nino will happen. It still might, but it will be like flipping a coin at this stage. So it's something to keep in mind. Don't panic yet. Check in with the Bureau around June and see what's going on then. That's why they don't issue these forecasts so early. It's just not reliable. Okay, so something that I want to kind of talk about, I saw Mark had a very similar slide in his talk last year about the public perception of climate change. So the dark blue line is looking at those who think climate change is a critical threat and we need to take action no matter what the cost is. The light blue line is that, yes, climate change is important, but, we've got a bit of time, it's not so critical. And the blue line is like we shouldn't do anything until we have hard data. Now, something that I find quite concerning about this graph, in 2025, those who think climate change is critical has declined. Those who think it's not that critical has increased, as well as those who think we should wait. Now, I don't know what's causing this. It may just be a blip. Hopefully it is. But maybe it's reflective of what's going on in the US, our own local politics at the moment. I don't know. But this is something we need to be really concerned about, as we need to move to a more renewable future. Okay, so I only have 2 minutes left, so I'll try and get through the last couple of parts really quickly. I did want to touch on some science that's been done locally in Australia and actually led by scientists here at ANU. We are now at the stage where we can quantify the effects both individual fossil fuel projects and individual fossil fuel companies have on climate change and impacts. So this study led by Neroli Abram showed how we can track that for particular fossil fuel projects on the Great Barrier Reef, heat exposure or heat deaths, and also those living in a safe climate zone. We are actually expanding this work to look at other climate impacts, and we'll have an online tool developed in the next few months. And this came out around the same time as another 2 projects conducted overseas that were able to show how individual fossil fuel companies contributed to previous economic impacts of heat waves, as well as the intensity and frequency of previous heat waves as well. So we're now moving into an era where we can actually point the finger and say, that is the impact you're causing, you shouldn't pollute anymore. We now are also looking at what a climate looks like in a post-net zero world. And I don't have a lot of time to dwell on this, but I just want to say it is not good at all. I've looked at these climate simulations and they were run by our local climate model. And they basically are 1,000 years, assuming net zero occurs between 2030 and 2060 at 5-year intervals. And you can see there that the global average temperature is very different between those 5-year increments. So it really does matter when we reach net zero. The later that we reach net zero, I'll move to the next slide, the more likely we are to have ice-free summers in Antarctica, and the worst heat waves will be virtually everywhere in the world. So if we look at heat waves 500 years after net zero is reached in 2060, they are worse than a 2 degrees warmer world. And spoiler alert, for Australia, the trends in heat waves just keep going up no matter when we reach net zero. And this is because we think of what's going on in the Southern Ocean and how it's heating up. Now, when I looked at this data, it's some of the worst projections I've looked at, and really one of those sobering moments where I stopped saying, oh yes, the world will get better in 50 or 100 years' time after net zero. It's going to be a lot longer after that, if at all. So we must reach net zero as soon as we possibly can. And on top of that, although mitigation of carbon emissions is absolutely imperative, I cannot stress that enough, adaptation too is also imperative. Now, that won't fix climate change, but it'll make us more able to survive and cope with those conditions. Now, lastly, I just want to finish. This is my last slide, I promise. Lately, and maybe because, I'm a bit of a masochist, I've been reading some climate fiction around climate change. So a lot of you have probably read Ministry for the Future already and Tim Winton's Juice. Now, Ministry for the Future, I haven't actually brought myself to finish yet because it's so realistic and I can relate to it so much. But the book starts with this enormous heatwave over India with many millions of people killed. And when I read that first chapter, I cried because I could see that being a reality. Maybe not now, maybe in 10 years, maybe in 20 or 30. But the mixture of high heat, high humidity, low adaptive capacity, low public education is a true recipe for disaster. That can happen. Similarly, reading Tim Winton's Juice, it's very much a Mad Max type world set in sometime in the future. Climate change has got out of control and everyone has to live underground simply to survive during summer. We are not there yet, but if we do reach something like 4 degrees warming, that's ultimately where we'll be. And I'm sure we can all agree that isn't where we want to be. And with that, I'll leave it there.
Thanks very much, Sarah, for that sobering sort of summary there. So just for people both online and here, is that last slide actually said where we don't want to be. That was just the little thing was covering up the don't word. And it sort of does change the message a little. But as I said, that's a really great summary of what's going on at multiple levels, at the global, national, and local level. And it's really, I think, important to have that sort of different scale in terms of the understanding of climate science, just as I think increasingly it's important to have that understanding in terms of climate adaptation, which Johanna and others are going to be talking about later today. So we do need those, large-scale global goals on adaptation at the global level, just like we need the National Adaptation Plan, just like we need action at community and household level, because all of those things matter, and it's how we stitch those together and actually make progress on those that is going to tell us whether the future we're going to head into is one which is less risky or more risky, I think is perhaps the way to put it. So we've got only a few minutes here, so I want to make sure there's plenty of time for Q&A. But one of the things that really concerned me, Sarah, about your presentation was that slide on public perceptions, so the Lowy Institute poll. And for a long time, that's been showing, if you add up the two top categories, about 90% of Australians want more action on climate change, split between those who are really keen and those who are somewhat keen on action, with relatively minor numbers of people who say we don't want action. What we're seeing at the moment on that slide is an uptick in the people who don't think climate change needs action, and a downward slide in terms of the people who want action, going from roughly 90% down to sort of 84% in the current time. So given the sort of information that you were presenting there, Sarah, I think it's really important to actually have some understanding of what's going on and why this might be occurring, and just want your take on that.
Yep, I'll just stand up here, actually. It feels odd to be sitting down now. I actually ran out of time to talk about this, but this is really dark. But I think one of the things might be that, as again, I don't like saying this, but we haven't had a disaster at scale in the last 6 years to put it fresh in people's mind. So 2019, 2020, Black Summer, that was a real turning point. So suddenly 2/3 of Australia were very serious about climate change and what we need to do. And I don't want a disaster of that scale. I'm not wishing that upon us, but people have short-term memories when it comes to weather and climate. And there is some research around this that it's a matter of years before people forget about that last disaster and how hot or how cold some place might be. So I think that's part of it. But I do think global politics and maybe even regional politics is playing into that as well.
So thanks, Sarah. And I think some years ago there was a few studies which showed that political leadership was actually crucial in terms of people's attitudes to climate change, and where you don't have that, you get long-term degradation in terms of people's support for action. And it seems to me that that's what's happening here. And unfortunately, with the recent polls in terms of movements to sort of one nation and possibly changes in leadership in the coalition, that could actually accelerate that, because we're going to be getting likely anti-climate change messages very consistently. And what psychology shows us is that if those messages just come and drip feed, drip, 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 there's no climate change, or you don't have to worry about it, or it's too expensive, or it's too difficult to do, that just reinforces those attitudes. So I think we do, as a community, have to step up and communicate the science, communicate the facts, the consequences, and also communicate that there's lots of options that we can take to reduce, not necessarily remove, the risk from climate change. That's what we talk about with climate adaptation. So it's really good that we're covering that later in this session. I'll just leave it there because I was getting signs that we have to finish this little discussion component. But just, I think one of the key things for me is the question of intergenerational equity in inequity that occurs, as well as the geographical inequity that some of your slides show. And one of the real hopeful signs for me is how young people are much more climate aware, they're much more climate responsive, and they're taking decisions in their own lives, which actually matter both individually and cumulatively. And as a parent, I'm just wondering how you reflect on that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I guess we're in a place of privilege that we can afford to do things like have solar panels, have a battery, have EV cars. So our kids are being exposed to that from an early age, that what you need to do to conserve power, and live in a way that protects yourself as well. But yeah, I struggle with how unfair it is. And I do have conversations with my older kids about what climate change is now in an age-appropriate way. But also, it pangs in the back of my mind that when they're my age, the world is going to be so much worse than what it is now, and it's not their fault. So there's a strong sense of responsibility there that we need to do more. Even if we don't have children, we all have family that are younger than us. We need to protect it for them and their peers. But how to make everyone aware of that? I'm sure everyone in the room agrees with this. But how to make the general public aware of this? It's a really hard problem to solve.
Thanks. So I think we just move into Q&A. Is that right, Kate? Okay. So we have some potential for questions from the audience here and online, although I'm not quite sure how the online ones are going to get communicated with us.
I will ask them for the online
Amellina.
audience. So we have a question from Uday online, which really follows the thread of the conversation you've been having, and maybe to reflect on the general population not being or rather the general population being influenced by the political discourse and vice versa. The question from Uday is really about the people who make decisions. So going back maybe to politicians, but there are other influential actors in the world, I think, that we should recognize. And the question is really about whether you think that they are across the gravity of the situation. So a little bit relevant to that science communication aspect, but is it really about communicating the facts, or is it about creating a narrative around the impact, I suppose, in a way that is more relatable, maybe along the lines of some of the books that you were talking about, Sarah?
Yeah, that's a really good question, an important one. I think we need to remember that not everyone absorbs information in the same way. So what figures and charts I showed today won't work for everyone, and I'm well aware of that fact. We need different ways of communicating it, and that is with people in decision-making places as well. But also what Mark was referring to with the small tidbits of information, there is a term for this, I don't like it, but inoculation, communication inoculation. So you just drop little bits of information in everyday discourse, and it builds up that bank. And we can do that with climate science too, Here's a heat wave. Oh, yes, heat waves are likely to become more common with climate change. Your water bill's going up. Oh, yes, this is, and just dropping it in those little tidbits relating to everyday life. That does go a long way, but we're not doing enough of that, I would say. So that's for the general public as well as for people in decision making as well. I think we need to do a better job at that. Yeah.
And I absolutely agree with that. And I think a core part of this is the narrative that actually makes this consequential for people. So moving past the facts into what this means and also what people can do about it. Because if you have a problem but you can't do anything about it, then there's a tendency to just let it go. So you have to have both a diagnosis of the issue and also a solutions package that's implementable in people's context. So if you have those things, then all of a sudden you've got at least the basis for some progress.
Thank you, Sarah. That was a wonderful presentation. Sorry, I'm having a trouble standing up. Yeah, so my question is around the people's perception that you have for Australia, right? So just wanted to understand, is there any analysis that talks about, how different countries think about it? Is the perception trend same across the world, or is this more than that? I think on the narrative building, what you said, the diagnosis and the solutions, that should be communicated parallelly, because otherwise it actually inculcates fear, and sometimes it makes the issue more elitist, right? Not relatable to the general audience. So can we kind of change the narrative around things which are more relatable and humanize the issue a little more? So just on that, your thoughts.
So in short, yes, we should be doing that. It is, I will admit, it is getting harder and harder for myself to get out. Like, firstly, I'm not an adaptation expert, so I can't list what's appropriate for certain communities in great detail, but that's something that we should be doing better as a package. But, you know, we are doing that today. But, you know, getting up and say, like, this is bad, this is worse, this is even more worse year on year. Firstly, it's taxing. But secondly, like, I don't want to pull the cotton wool over people's eyes. You know, it is getting worse. But that, I can understand that that's makes people very scared. And I can fully appreciate that. And something, again, that I wish I had time for to dwell on in the talk was, yes, we should allow space to feel that, but we shouldn't sit in that if we can at all help it, because it's very immobilizing. At the very least, we should get angry and then turn that anger into action. But yes, what that action looks like, we do need to do a better job in making that well known and saying everything's going to poo. You know, too bad. That's not going to work. It doesn't work for anyone.
Thank you.
I'll chip in as well. Just a reflection on essentially that narrative that you're talking about, which is people don't understand climate change and science, in a sense, has failed to communicate the significance of this. I would contest that. That survey that was shown up there, like 84% of people want more action on climate change in Australia. That number is pretty much the same number as comes in surveys across the globe. So it varies a little bit from survey to survey. So what that says is the vast majority of people in Australia and across the globe get that climate change is not a good thing for them or for their children. So we haven't failed. It's not the science community that hasn't failed in terms of communicating this issue. The failure is in the politics, it's in industry politics and in governmental politics, and to some extent it's with us in terms of not starting to go down that pathway of action, because oftentimes as soon as we actually start to take action, we find that it's much easier and better than we ever thought it would be. So it brings lots of co-benefits. So I would actually start to change that narrative and say we've been incredibly successful in terms of providing their baseline understanding, but we haven't yet brought the science that allows that understanding to be taken into action. So we need to change the nature of the science that we're doing, or at least the emphasis on science, and put in place a lot more of the social science and institutional science that enables us to start taking action in simple ways.
Thank you. Yeah, that's actually great. Thank you.
There's a question over there. We've probably got time for one more question. So, and okay, a quick one and then one online. Okay.
Thank you very much. I can see a ray of hope in all of this, which is the new generations being more aware and willing to do more stuff. Are we doing enough to leverage this to create real change? Like, are there way to explore how we can leverage this power, because they will become in power eventually? So how can we start leveraging this from very young ages so they can be responsible of the change eventually?
That's a really good question. My kids are too young for me to make them angry enough to go vote or campaign politicians. But I think, honestly, again, I think it might come back to the inoculation, like keep doing it, keep talking about it. If, you know, there's evidence that as we get older, our views become more conservative, and that's a very general statistic. But when it comes to climate change, we have to try and make sure that doesn't happen with the younger generation. How to do that, again, I don't know, but I'm making sure I talk about it with my kids as often as I possibly can. Like, for example, a few weeks ago, I got a question, Mum, what's carbon dioxide? So I talked to her about it in an age-appropriate way, but that doesn't hurt to tell her what's going on and have those conversations. And when the conversations come up like, oh, this isn't good, leverage off that. You know, well, this is what you need to do. This is how you protect yourself. This is how you protect your country. And this is how you look after the planet. And just, I think, you know, you have to talk about it early and just keep those conversations going. Don't let it be overrun by one nation or the coalition. Keep those conversations going.
And I think it's really important to legitimise understanding and questions on climate change. And at the moment, I think in Australia, we're not doing a great job on that. So, for example, we haven't got climate change in the national curriculum. We need, I think, to have that in because it's such a critical issue. And also we have protest laws, which actually tell young people that if you actually start to protest about the things that you care about, you may end up in jail or with a criminal record. And I think that's a real disincentive for young people to engage in these topics. So I think there's a few things we can do there. Now, I'm being told that I need to wind that up, but there is one question that Evelina wants to ask.
There are 6 online questions now coming in hot and fast right at the end. I'm going to try and bring them together and then you can comment on the bits that are relevant. There are a few that continue to reflect on the importance of influencing policy and politics. And maybe in that vein, I'd be interested in your reflections on research as advocacy, and specifically maybe what, as climate scientists or other climate researchers, we in the academic community have a responsibility to do in that political policy space. The other questions are specifically around implications of some of the climate science presented for food systems, particularly in Australia, but I think that's a reflection maybe on Australia's relevance to the rest of the world and also our reliance perhaps on the rest of the world. Same in the context of mining. There's a lot happening in this space, but maybe in bringing food systems and mining together, reflecting on that relevance of our global positioning in Australia.
Okay, so I'll start with the first part. Look, obviously I take my role in advocacy and communication very seriously, but I fully acknowledge not all climate scientists want to do that, and nor should they feel pressured. I think we need more climate communicators out there, and I strongly support anyone who wants to do that, and we have mechanisms to support them develop that. But we shouldn't put the pressure on everyone, because some people are they just don't want to talk about things. That's just not natural to them, or nor do they have an interest in it. So I don't want to put the pressure on all climate scientists, but definitely we should encourage more of them and support more of them for those that want to do it. And it's something we need to continue doing. That's imperative. In terms of politics and, you know, relying on food and agriculture and mining and whatever else globally, yeah, look, I don't know if I have a full answer about what we need to do. There is research going on, like literally on the thermal limits of crops here at ANU and how bad that is and how we need to move to other ways of eating and getting food. We are in a better position than other countries because we are quite privileged here. But ultimately, there will become tension in countries that don't have those resources or that capabilities. So what that means in terms of regional conflict or global conflict and migration, well, I don't believe anyone's taking that seriously. I don't have an answer on how to fix that, I'm afraid.
Yeah, so it looks like I've got the last word. But in terms of mining and agriculture, etc., we are not simply funding that research here in Australia, and as a result, we're falling behind. We aren't producing the options for people that our science could actually provide in a different circumstance. In terms of advocacy, science advocacy, I think we've got to be a little careful in that, because just speaking out about science can be done in different ways. So you can advocate for positions, which is using words like should and needs and things like that. So government should do this, government needs to do that. Or you can communicate science in essentially neutral ways, which are not policy prescriptive. And that's how I sort of try to approach things. And so it's policy informing, but not policy prescriptive. And there are different ways of doing it. So if you look at science policy sort of literature, advocates for any issue tend to close down your options. You know, here's the way of doing something. If you want to be neutral in terms of your science, you have to be an honest broker, which is opening up the options. So you're saying, here are several different options that you can undertake, and they all have different consequences. They have different pros and cons. So you need to actually differentiate, I think, in terms of science communication between those different approaches, those different goals. And the last point I'd make is that it's not just advocacy from research. I also think something Australia underdoes is diplomacy. So research as a glue that binds nations together. And we've seen that through the climate science. The World Climate Research Program, WMO, etc. But we also need to think about it in terms of climate change. How can we use research as a way of pulling countries together for common purpose, using common information and growing the adaptation and climate science pie rather than fragmenting it? So I might just leave this session here because I've been told to wrap it up, and say thanks very much to Sarah. And to introduce Jason Alexandra, who is a joint fellow between the Institute of Water Futures here at ANU and also ICEDS. Welcome, Jason.
Thank you. That was a great session. Welcome everybody to the next session where we're going to shift focus to adaptation, which we got the great introduction to say it is increasingly important and it's not a binary between mitigation and adaptation. The session is called Adaptation from Above, and I think perhaps we should be calling it Adaptation on Earth, supported from above. And it made me, and a lot of it's about the role of science and technology. And just reading the brief introduction, it made me reflect on this and how powerful technology is. When I started work, you probably need a computer that filled this room to be as powerful as this. Now we have it. We're connected to all kinds of information, satellite information that might be warning us about floods or bushfires. So we're going to explore some of the issues about how science and technology and satellites and the like can support adaptation. And we know that that technology is very powerful in terms of provision and dissemination of information. I guess the big question is, are we very good at acting, both short-term and long-term, on information? And that came through in the earlier session. So we have two speakers, similar format to the previous one. The first speaker is Associate Professor Johanna Nalau, who works at Griffith University, is a researcher who researches the role of science in supporting decision-making in a wide range of capacities, but including working with the IPCC. And then Professor Anna Moore is going to offer a short response, not unlike what Mark did. And Anna is the director of the InSpace Institute here at ANU. And InSpace is a bit like ICEDS in the sense that it engages researchers from across the university in the challenges and opportunities of a space-enabled society. So first of all, over to Johanna.
There we go. Yes. Good. So, perfect. So my name is Johanna Nalau. I am, thank you. Adjusting to my level. Yes, I'm an associate professor in climate adaptation at Griffith University. I'd like to start saying that I'm an adaptation expert. So I work on adaptation. I'm also coordinating lead author for Chapter 4 in Working Group 2 in AR7. I'm not talking in my IPCC capacity today. So I became interested a few years ago on the Earth observations and their data and capabilities to support climate adaptation decision and policy-making processes. And I wanted to acknowledge also some of my colleagues who I'm working with. So Sarah Connors from European Space Agency and Carlo Buontempo from Copernicus. So today I thought I'll speak a little bit about different examples and the emerging space that we are seeing. So Earth observations have been used a lot for mitigation, but the conversation in terms of how can that support also climate adaptation is emerging now as well. So I think there is increasingly an understanding that Earth observations can support climate-related processes and adaptation in particular. So we know there has been a lot of policies, adaptation policies, a lot of adaptation planning, but we still don't have a good understanding on how we are progressing globally as well. And so Earth observations brings another dimension to that. So key global data that's often over long timeframes as well. And Earth observations are also huge direct indirect value for adaptation. So it provides the essential inputs, for instance, into reanalysis, such as Era 6, this is currently one of the most used data sources for climate adaptation. So I think the way that we are currently discussing Earth observation is that it is one line of evidence. So for climate adaptation, we obviously need population data, health data. So we are looking at combinations. So for risk assessment and mapping, so it's quite useful in looking at vulnerable areas on the coast. It can be used for tracking habitat loss and gain, for instance, heat in cities and how adaptation interventions are actually changing temperatures, crop optimizations, flooding, detecting wildfires, and supporting different global goals as well. So we have the SDGs, but we also have the global goal on adaptation into Paris agreements. And a lot of the conversations have been traditionally focused only on hazards with Earth observation data and the kind of real-time disaster risk reduction, whereas there is increasing interest in mapping exposure and mapping climate vulnerability as well as part of adaptation. So for those who are not familiar, so the global goal on adaptation comes from the Paris Agreement that Sarah was mentioning. So it has 7 thematic targets and also 4 dimensional targets that map the adaptation cycle. So there is increasingly discussions, well, now that we have these global targets, how are we actually going to measure and monitor if they are being implemented and if we are progressing? So this has inspired some recent work at the International Space Science Institute, where we ran a workshop a few years ago, thinking about, well, what is the role of Earth observations for climate adaptation? What are the key issues that we really need to think about when we look at these thematic targets for GGA? And are there particular data sets or ways that we could, Earth observations could actually assist? As I said, it's one line of evidence. So thinking about what types of combinations could be useful. And so this figure is from the paper that maps really the adaptation cycle. So it's looking at, well, impacts and risk assessment. What are some of the Earth observation examples, systems and data sets that could be helpful? What are some of the Earth observation capabilities when it comes to adaptation planning, for instance? So thinking about what responses should be implemented where and when. For instance, what are the urban areas suitable for solar or, for instance, for greening in cities? But it also looks at implementation. So we have idea what actions need to be taken. And so Earth observation can then be also mapped in terms of thinking where these areas are and how the implementation can progress. So for instance, percentages of rooftops that contain green roofs. And that brings us to the last step of the adaptation cycle, which is the monitoring and evaluation. And that's where a lot of the interest is going in at the moment. So understanding, is adaptation progressing? What are the actual outcomes of those actions that we are putting in place? If we are doing citywide greening, is it actually working? Is it lowering temperatures? Is it producing all the benefits that we think these do? So there is increasing focus on the kind of outcome indicators as well. So avoided impacts or reductions in risk. So is the flooded areas, for instance, in a particular location, are they decreasing or increasing? So this work has then led to other work again at the International Space Science Institute. So we had a workshop in December after the IPCC lead author meeting where we discussed different factors that relate to the actual use of Earth observations data. And that was very much focused on, okay, we have these Earth observations data sets and systems in place. How are those capable of supporting the local level adaptation planning and implementation? And how do we address some of the epistemic injustices? Because a lot of the data is not uniform globally. And especially when you start downscaling and going into local level information, especially in developing countries, there are still huge gaps. So how do we actually help communities to even access the data that could be available? And we discussed a lot about the data usability. the context in which decisions are being made, but also the role of local knowledge. So how do you bring these kind of global Earth observation data and then match that with the local knowledge and experience of environmental and social change as well? And what are some of the new approaches? So all of those discussions are being turned into papers at the moment as well. But I think what was really interesting was that I was the only adaptation person at that workshop from a more social science point of view. And so we had lots of working group 1 climate scientists, and that was a really interesting conversation because these concepts mean something very different, even across the IPCC working group. So when we say locally relevant information, that can have really different interpretations. What local means. Is it place-based? Is it just a community? Or is it that geographical area? And maybe it's all of those. And so how do you bring these different data sets together? And I have to say that I actually stepped away quite inspired, having been at the workshop, because I think there is so much capability in the Earth observation systems and data that could be locally relevant. And we need to figure out how to do that well. So I wanted to share some examples that we have been talking about in terms of highlighting what are some of the current approaches. So one of the, in India, one of the projects that is actually using thermal intelligence, so they're tracking land surface temperature patterns, and that relates to nature-based solutions and ecosystem-based adaptation. So they're trying to understand, well, how are these changes actually spatially taking place, but what are the actual outcomes from nature-based solutions? And I have to say that the nature-based solutions is probably one of the, I'm not going to say easiest, but one of the current frontiers, how we can understand adaptation outcomes and how to actually track them. So there are lots of projects, for instance, mapping spatially mangroves with satellite data and trying to understand, for instance, decreases in coastal erosion and coastal hazards as well. We had also in the session titled Disaster Risk Reduction. So there are also examples emerging how governments and different agencies are actually using real-time satellite-based data. So this is an example from Sweden, where they use the satellite data for wildfire detection in real time. And they are finding that using these systems, they're actually able to detect 90% of the fires. And this is obviously critical information so they can act on them before the fires get out of hand. Another Australian example, so there has been a startup called IC, and that's really using a different type of data and different type of satellites. So this is able to give real-time flood and bushfire data for Australia. So Australian government signed an agreement with IC, I think 2023, and this agreement now with both the Geospatial and Esri Australia was just signed end of last year. So it's more about data availability and capability, but they have flood rapid intelligence, flood insight and bushfire insight platforms. So those can now be combined to the ArchiGIS platform, and that's available for different levels of government, different organizations as well. But that's more the real-time monitoring aspect of it. So some of the current activities and processes, so there's a lot going on in this space at the moment. So the Committee of Earth Observation Satellites is developing an Earth Observations for Climate Adaptation handbook. And that's collecting globally all kinds of examples of how is Earth observation actually being used for climate adaptation. And that should be hopefully available later 2026. There's also a recent EU-funded project called Underpin, and that is looking at outcome indicators, measuring progress on climate adaptation, and it's trying to combine Earth observation data, citizen science, and also using AI tools, developing new indicators. The European Space Agency had a grant call late last year, 2025, on climate adaptation indicators. And that call was specifically to look at Earth observations data and demonstrate how do you construct and design climate adaptation indicators that are useful and enable the tracking of progress. And new partnerships as well. So the Copernicus Climate Change Service and the Atmosphere Monitoring Service are now collaborating also for the last 2 years with the European Investment Bank. So they are very interested, obviously, in how they can spatially assess climate risk through the assessment tool. But what kind of data do you actually need to understand climate adaptation? And I think as an adaptation scientist, I often face this challenge that a lot of people understand emissions, they understand mitigation, it's easily quantifiable how much you're reducing. But when it comes to adaptation, it's not as clear. So I definitely agree with Sarah's and Mark's comments that we do need to up the communication as well on that. And so I wanted to leave you with some questions. So often there's a lot of data, there's a lot of capability out there in Earth observations community. And often the question that we had even at the workshop, they said, well, what do you want? Like, what does the adaptation community want? You just tell us and we'll give you the data. And I said, well, what data do you have? And they said, no, you tell us what you need and we give you the data. And again, we said, well, what is the data that you have? So I think there is a lot of information out there. There's different ways of combining spatial data sets. But I think we as an adaptation community also need to understand what that data is for and how it can be analyzed. So I think there is this really, really key emerging conversations, how we can work together. But it's questions like, so if we talk about adaptation progress, well, how do we know that is actually happening? So that relates a lot to the indicators, not just to the GGA, but all kinds of levels. And I think this discussion is really interesting, given that we finally now have a national adaptation plan for Australia. So what are the capabilities that we have, for instance, in the country that could support the monitoring and evaluation of the adaptation plan as well? And this is a question I always ask, and people think I'm nuts. Can we see adaptive capacity from space? So if we saw it, what would that look like? And that's another conversation that we're having, because adaptive capacity, again, is very dependent on governance, social equity and justice issues. So how do we actually bring all this knowledge and information together to understand what that looks like? But also the discussion, what decision need what type of data? And this goes back to the conversation with the Earth observations community and the adaptation community, so that we can actually understand what information is out there that is relevant for climate adaptation and how we use that then in practice. Thank you.
I'm told, I'm instructed that because we're running short on time, we're going to move straight into questions, but we're going to give Anna the chance to be one of the respondents to the questions. So sorry about that if we were expecting to give a talk. So any questions from the floor or from the internet?
Oh, it's really great to be here. I know we're short on time. I'm a professor of astronomy. I don't know how many other astronomers are here, but that direction changed around 10 years ago when access to space was completely changed for the global community. And so love or hate Elon Musk, he's changed how you can get to space, who can get there, and what you can do in it. And so it was at that time that I realized that I had to jump out of my own little discipline of astronomy and ask everyone else, look, what can we be doing here? What are the benefits to you? And maybe that steers us about our choices that we make. And I had amazing conversations with everyone from the Earth observation community to College of Asia Pacific, and even the ANU School of Music, whose director was the first respondent to my email saying, hey, what can we do? And he said, beam me up, Scotty. I'm going to write your theme tune to your website, which he did. So it made me realize that, you know, when you come in with positive, how can this change the dial for you? What are the benefits of doing this? Even if we're starting from a low base, people come to the table and they want to scope things with you. I also wanted to say it's wonderful to be here on Ngunnawal country. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Thank you. I hope that wasn't too long. Sorry, I feel like I've given a speech now, but it's lovely to be here.
Yeah, hi, thank you. It was a fantastic presentation. We heard from the earlier presentation about the, let's call them rather regressive policies of the current US administration, but one area that I have some familiarity with, and I'd love to get your take on it, that they have also been quite regressive, is on some of the more established Earth observation programs, some of which have been in orbit now for decades. I understand that some of that data is being turned off, no longer openly available. I'm so interested in what you think the impact of that will be and how important some of those projects are.
There's no other way to say it. I think it's, I'm always a glass half full person, so I'll start with the, I think there are, you know, incredibly damaging effects to cutting off these quite sophisticated programs, you know, that, you know, I talk about solutions and low Earth orbit as being something new, but there's also some things that you have to do with the larger scale missions, the fidelity of that kind of measurement. And it's really hard to just come in with $100,000 solution to that overnight. And so, yeah, I think that's going to be incredibly difficult. I do worry about data that we're heavily reliant on other people's data. That's my understanding in the Australian community. We've already seen the knock-on effects of that for bushfires. You know, a few years ago, we lost access to the Himawari satellite, not because they switched it off, it was because something was happening in Japan and they had to reallocate that geo satellite and we couldn't have data for it. So the glass half full, so yeah, it's bad. It's bad. And programs can be switched on, trying to refill the people knowledge capacity that's been broken, I think, a little bit in the US is more also of a concern too. 14,000 people have left the science community in the US. And so even though the budget's gone back again across those agencies, it'll take a lot of effort to get back to where they were. I'm sorry, that's very negative, but I'm just being pragmatic. Glass half full. We're in a new regime where we can come up with new solutions. We can't solve everything, but it's a lot cheaper if you're clever to do it now. So, and we do have domestic capability here, so we're not going to solve for everything, but you can do some things, and especially on the area I've been working on with Marty Ebber at ANU and the New South Wales Fire Organisations, the things on predicting bushfires before they're going to happen, using fuel load, for example. This is new. No one else is doing it. We should be doing it. So let's do more of that and put a bit more of that sovereignty back for us. That's what I think.
A question from online.
Yeah, great. A question for Johanna, or maybe you both actually, in relation to Earth observations and satellite data. There are a couple of questions from the online audience about the value provided from visualizing and mapping that data, particularly going back to the importance of communication. So using that as a communications tool, particularly again for those who are not scientists or don't have the rigorous background information. And in relation to that, the issue of equity. And so how that visualization or maybe different ways of communicating information applies to equity, but also the IP barriers that maybe relate to using or relying on other people's data sets at a global level as well.
I can say, yeah, I think the visualization aspect is really powerful. And we've come across so many projects where they're actually using that. So they're, for instance, tracking land degradation or the extent of mangroves. So they are able to really visualize and show. And that's why I like the project from India, because that really shows even though that's not satellite pictures, it really clearly shows the change. And I think that can be quite a powerful ways to communicate the science as well. So showing the actual changes, because climate change for a lot of people who don't work in this space, and adaptation even more so, it's sometimes really fussy and it's not easy to always understand, well, what do we mean by adaptation? But there has been amazing examples, visualizations in particular for heat in cities, and how you can see the thermal maps and then you see the greening efforts and nature-based solutions, for instance, that have been put in place, and the impact that has on air quality, but also the lowering of the temperature in cities. So I think it is really, really powerful. On the equity aspects, I think, so in the workshop, we focused a lot on that. So how do we make sure that, obviously developed countries have more sophisticated systems, and there's also more capacity to understand and use that type of data. So there was a lot of talk about, how do we build capacity? Because there is so much information out there, but it will also come down, how do you actually do you know how to use that data? And for instance, to create these visualizations. The last thing I would say, visualizations are also very political. So we know cases where coastal hazards or, climate scenarios have been mapped. And those maps are not being released just because there's so much anxiety that once people actually see what might happen, there will be backlash, for instance, from the community.
Just to add to that excellent response, I went to a conference recently which was very space focused a few years ago, and there was a gentleman there from the African. I'm sorry, I don't know the full title, but he represented a range of African countries in the Earth observation space. He spoke absolutely beautifully and very powerfully, and he got across to a bunch of space tech bros. I shouldn't really say that way, but it was a bit like that, I have to say. And he got across the importance of, you'll really make it with your space solutions when you connect with individuals. When a human person can make a decision that affects and benefits their life on an individual basis, which means then you've made it. That's what the world needs now. And I think it really resonated with a lot of people that was there. And that was more a general comment about, he related it to a local fishing community who were trying to understand these quite complex data sets that were coming out of Earth, and you had to have calibration data. I mean, this was fishermen, and I looked at the website and I couldn't understand it either. And all they wanted to know is, can I go out today or not? Is it a good day for me to go out fishing or not? That's all, a red light and a green light. That was it. And because that initial conversation hadn't happened about what are the benefits to you? What are the benefits to you to doing this? Because that never happened, the solution wasn't there at the end of the day. So that's a more general comment about space data, but I think it might resonate with the climate discussion we had today. And if you don't mind me saying, I have to say, I think it's good to be quite, if something so powerful like the world is facing cataclysmic outcomes, it matters to everyone. It doesn't matter if you're from one political party or another. There's always a reason why you'll care. You just have to cage it in a way that they understand, that person and their communities understand. So everyone cares about it if it's explained in a way that resonates with their community. That's what I found with space, at least. Thank you.
Other questions? Hands up. Thank you. There's somebody, one of the mic runners. Yep.
Thank you. Very fantastic presentation. So I am from Sri Lanka. So climate adaptation are very important of the developing countries. So our countries are the size of the very small. So and also GDP is very low of the country. Because therefore we have to focus on some climate adaptation, because our GDP is very low. Not only Sri Lanka, but also most of Asian, African, and Latin American countries. So in the recently, the US president cutting off some aid for the developing countries, but most of developing countries are getting from support the NGOs or some developed countries aid, but unfortunately, recently the cutting of some donors of the international organization for the US. So my question is, what happened of this situation? And what is the suggestion of the your opinion for this situation?
I think if I try to simplify the question, are there a set of issues with the way we're internationally handling aid development and adaptation within the overseas aid programs? Is that particularly with recent cuts? Is that?
Yeah.
Yep. So do you want to have a go at it? I mean, I think it's an interesting point. We have international cooperation in space, but perhaps less so on things that really matter on the ground.
Look, I think it's I've heard from so many colleagues in developing countries how devastating consequences the aid cuts have already had, and I think there is opportunity for other countries to step up as well, especially for Australia. In terms of climate adaptation, I think we are increasingly seeing, other organizations and countries stepping in and trying to fill that void. But obviously the funding cuts are so massive that that's probably not, it's not enough at the moment. But I think it is also about looking for new partnerships. And there is a lot of talk now about adaptation technologies and how do we actually look at some of those emerging technologies when they're coming down in price, and those, could advance adaptation much faster and quicker in developing countries in particular.
Anna, do you want to respond? No. Okay, we've got another question from Zoom.
To follow on the recent question, and this is my personal question, I suppose, before I go to the online question, reflecting on the fact that resources, particularly financial, are limited, I think there's a really interesting question around how much we try to monetize adaptation in the climate change space. Mitigative action is obviously much more largely aligned, at least in some people's views, with profit making or the way that the world society kind of currently functions. So maybe as framing, thinking about the monetization of adaptation and adaptive technologies in particular that you just mentioned, a question from online that relates to this is largely going back to, again, Earth observation data being used in tandem with climate projections to maybe predict the way that land cover, ecosystem variation will look like against different climate futures. And again, I guess it goes back to how do we visualize, how do we maybe tell a narrative that helps us then create opportunities for investment in particular ways that might align with increasing adaptive capacity of the natural environment. So do you have any examples maybe where that has already been done, or do you have a vision maybe for what that might look like in the future, or how to incentivize that?
Okay, I think it's a great question. It's around this question of whether public provision or private provision, monetized provision of information, and there's probably not a perfect answer to it. Probably the answer is it depends. But if everybody thinks about something as simple as the weather forecasts that are provided to the public free of charge, in order for thousands or millions of better decisions to be made, you go, that's really good use of public resources to provide information. And so to Anna's example, to the fishermen, the translation of satellite or Earth observation data to simple decision, things that enable decision, applications that enable good decisions. So rather than people risking their lives or requiring rescuing, they had some predictions in advance. So I guess I would put the question mostly in terms of are we really applying the technical capabilities that we have in terms of data and Earth observation into a whole range of applied decision-making contexts in a way? And have we got it right in terms of whether there's a monetized incentive or a public good incentive? It's a huge, huge question.
I can maybe start with just a small example. One of the very first projects or investments that we were excited about when we started our institute was in the bushfire mitigation area. And it came about from a conversation between Professor Marta Yebra from the Fenner School, who's an expert in bushfire prevention, evolution, etc., with actually an astronomy technology which was used to hunt for high redshifts, what's called high redshift supernovae, and I can talk about that later. A little bit hotter than 1.5 degrees, but anyway. The solution that we were looking at that was world first and still ours, called OzFuel, and it's an ability to do very high fidelity continental wide fuel load estimations, and this data, my understanding, this data can then be used to predict where to focus your efforts in a future oncoming heat wave or bushfire season with enough time to do something about it. So it moves the dial away from having to react instantly when there's really not much you can do except to, instantly react. The question was, how can we put a community together? If you had 2 months or 3 months or something like that, how can you shift the dial? How can you bring town management into it? How can you bring Indigenous communities that focus on backburning and land management? How can we bring in even perhaps fast response technologies to react? Because obviously Australia is a huge area. So that's a whole lot. And what I didn't expect was that the technical part and the scientific part of that whole project, which was very difficult, especially on Marta's side. The technology was quite easy on our side, but on her side was very difficult, having to come up with these libraries and databases to predict leaf traits and things like this. It's very difficult, but it was what was much harder was to understand how we were actually going to fund it in the first place. And the conversation came about between, well, should it be a public good versus a commercial story? And we got wrapped around the axle about it until we started to think about, well, let's forget about data sets and stuff like this. Let's talk about what actions or what benefits come from the data itself. And when you can compartmentalize that, it got a much easier conversation. So, for example, when we could say to an infrastructure company who cared about certain parts of that data set, they wanted to protect their infrastructure, all of a sudden they became engaged. But when we started talking to more of a public community, towns and who've been, affected by bushfires quite recently, they saw it more as a public good, and the state governments would come in and put money into it. So I think if we move past we've got this whole data set and how do we fund it, if you can think about the outcomes and the benefits to the stakeholders, I'm sorry to keep saying that, but it's what worked for us. What worked for us was, how can we use parts of this data to really change the dial on outcomes for these entities. So it turns out that part of it, there's more data than we'll ever use. Part of it is used for commercial reasons, part of it's used for public good, and that changed the dial. So it's not a solution for everything, but it's what worked for us. I'm not sure if that answers the question, but anyway.
I'll say a few very quick words because there's coffee. So I think we're increasingly seeing, the conversation around public-private partnerships and how do we monetize adaptation. It's interesting, a lot of the private sector is often, well, what is the business case? So you have to make a business case for adaptation first, and then, they will be looking at returns on investment. And there are venture capital firms, for instance, now starting to invest in adaptation technologies. And that's very much about creating those markets for climate adaptation. But I think there's ethical dimensions to it as well. So when we say, if we invest in adaptation, then I don't know, 30% less nature will be destroyed. And some people say, well, okay, so the 70% is okay then to just let go. So I think we need to also think about how we quantify the benefits, and it even gets more complicated when we talk about people's lives. So is it acceptable that, we are just making decisions that, okay, with these technologies and techniques and systems, some people will be safe and some others won't. So I think those are quite grounding ethical conversations that we also have to have when it comes to these investments in adaptation.
Thank you very much. So it is morning tea time, so I'm going to leave it there for the questions. I think I'm right, 20 minutes for morning tea. Then we're back in here for the final session. So applause for our great speakers. Thank you very much.
Hello. Hello, everybody. As we all filter back in, I would just like to let you know that we have spoken to the venue staff about the temperature in the room, and we are assured that it's on the to-do list. 1.52, it depends on how quickly you guys decarbonize. Let's go. So our next session starts at 11:20. If we could all take our seats, I would like to introduce our next moderator. We're lucky enough to be joined by some excellent researchers today, and Aryanie Amellina is one of them. She's our early career researcher who is a climate and environmental policy specialist. She's currently studying her PhD at the Fenner School of Environment and Society, and her research explores corporate and investor sustainability action and how that aligns with planetary and Earth system boundaries. And she's very generously giving up her time today to moderate our panel. So if you could all join me in a big round of applause for Aryanie. Thank you.
Thanks, Kate, for the introduction. Hello, everyone. I'm going to guide us through our final discussion, which is about adaptation implementation. Now, since the morning, we've talked about the future that we are stepping into, the climate changes that we are living through now. And there were a lot of questions being asked about what do we mean by adaptation? What is the capacity that exists in communities and in leadership and policymakers, and how do we increase those capacity? And how do we clarify what works and what may not work? So this session focuses on that. So hopefully some of your questions will be explored further. And we are going to focus on the practicalities of adaptation, climate change adaptation, implementation at the local level, and what we have also at the national level here in Australia. We will talk about what experiences communities have faced, what are the barriers in governance, in capacity, and also examples of adaptation in action. We will hear from Associate Professor Jo Mummery from the Centre for Environmental Governance, University of Canberra. Her current research explores how to develop science-practice interfaces to facilitate the implementation of effective and transitional climate change adaptation and risk management policies and measures. Dr. Mummery has considerable professional experience in driving partnerships that enhance the resilience of practice and decision processes in a changing climate. She has led the design, development, and delivery of national climate change adaptation initiatives and national coordination of climate change science as a senior executive in the APS, in the Australian Public Service. After a presentation, we will be joined by Nicole Mitchell, the branch head of the National Adaptation Policy Branch in the Department of Climate Change, Energy, the Environment, and Water. She leads national policy work on climate change adaptation, contributing to Australia's strategic response to climate risk and adaptation planning. So that's from the national adaptation lens. And our last but not least, the panelist is Jenny Edwards, a leading figure in residential energy performance and was named the 2023 National Energy Efficiency Champion. She brings extensive experience in building performance, community engagement, and the regulatory challenges shaping housing resilience. So we're very lucky to have these three experts today, and I would like to invite Associate Professor Jo Mummery to come up to the stage to deliver her presentation.
Thank you, Aryanie, and thank you to the ANU team for the opportunity to be part of this event today. I'd also briefly like to acknowledge the First Nations peoples of the lands on which we meet today, their elders and knowledge holders, and to recognise the deep insights they have about country, wildlife, sustainable management in periods of change. So today I'll talk briefly about, if I can go forwards. Is it backwards? I don't know. Forwards. I'll talk briefly about adaptation, the complexity of adaptation, interpretations at a local level with a couple of real world examples, and then end up with some points, I hope, with a little hope. So talking about adaptation now is a matter of urgency. The things we value, reliable water, quality food, our well-being, reliable infrastructure, regional security, all of those things are being affected by climate change. And that is not new news, as we know. In 2001, the IPCC had a significant focus on impacts and adaptation, and at that time it influenced the Australian government, and it led to a significant amount of action beginning to frame out adaptation. That's 25 years ago. What have we learnt since? Well, I think a key learning is that effective adaptation that really prepares us for future challenge, for future climate, is actually very hard. It requires taking into account the future in climate beyond most decision frames. It requires us to acknowledge that uncertainty is ongoing. It requires us to recognise we have multiple values which need to be considered in many decisions. And in many cases, our governance and decision systems don't support that. So perhaps unsurprisingly, we have a deficit in implementation of adaptation. And I'd like to highlight here the point that's in italics, and I'd like to refer to Emeritus Professor Mark Howden, who made this quote in his presentation in December symposium. But unfortunately, in Australia and globally, most observed adaptation is fragmented, small in scale, incremental, sector-specific, designed to respond to current or near-term impacts, focus more on planning rather than implementation. I mean, that is a really challenging state of play, and it's a huge starting point now in 2026 to find a way forward. But in the last 25 years, we've also learnt a lot about what the barriers are, what the constraints are. We're starting to learn a lot about what works and what doesn't work. We also recognise that people have a hardwired cognitive bias that discounts the future. Our thinking is much more around valuing short-term, instantaneous present. We're aware of that now. We can work with it. We know that political cycles, the long conflict about climate change in Australia, the power of some institutions that can influence government, political oppositionalism, for lack of a better way to describe it, get in the way of good policy. That points to the role of other decision makers in our society. And we know there's a whole range of constraints in leadership and resourcing, a lack of a clear vision across society, a lack of a compelling case for adaptation. So when we look at the local scale, adaptation is both critical and a challenge. Local governments have strong connections, close connections to communities. They have important roles, protecting local infrastructure, supporting local environments, communities, major roles through land use planning, etc., emergency management, building regulations, place-based solutions. Communities expect governments to protect them from avoidable impacts. One challenge in Australia, we work in a complex federated system. There are multiple overlapping roles and responsibilities. It's a very complex space. There are some areas where responsibilities aren't yet clear. They never will be. Subsidiarity works well for many things, but effective adaptation in many cases requires local government to access data, funding, legislative frameworks from higher spheres of government. Effective adaptation in many cases requires vertical integration. For a very quick example, if the settings are right, like insurance policies that incentivise risk, like building standards that ensure housing is comfortable in heat waves, like available information on compounding and cascading risks that can be used directly in land use planning, then local governments can deliver resilient housing. There's a big if there, which we need to be aware of to address. The Australian Local Government Association in 2025 did a fantastic report, pictures there, and it's definitely worth a read. In this report, ALGA starts doing some assessment of the contribution of local action to national risks. But importantly, they tease out an assessment of 219 local adaptation actions. Critically, 2/3 of these were linked to risks shared with other spheres of government or the private sector. In many cases, local government could influence risk management. They could not control it. Many actions were low cost, linked to internal processes, risk assessment, planning. Very few regulatory interventions were noted. Councils are also under significant strain. They've actually had to cope with a huge number of climate-related disasters over the last 20 years. It's massive. And we know that with each disaster, community resilience is lost and council resilience and capacity is lost. Future climate change will challenge that capacity even more. So local capacity is something that we have to look at for the security and coping abilities of all Australians. So I'd like to look at a couple of examples now, a couple of real-world examples. First one's housing. Housing is something which is often delivered through local development, but houses are big assets. They're long-life assets. They're the biggest expenditure of most people in their lifetime. The governance system for housing is really complicated. It spans all spheres of government and the private sector. Insurance, building codes, urban planning, zoning, social housing, the property market, which links both to international economic trends and driving capacity for social innovation, local innovation. There's also powerful industry associations which can influence governments, as we know. So we've got a bunch of really good action, great numbers of excellent examples, good work on energy efficiency, city greening. But there are some really big gaps. Current regulation is based on historic data. There's also gaps in building regulation with regard to future climate risks. Heat waves, good example, we've heard a bit about that earlier, but heat wave risks in houses is something which needs more attention. Bushfire smoke, again, we know critical for human health. Big gaps, we've got leaky housing in Australia by international standards, flood intensity, etc. We already know multiple areas at high risk where there's significant housing. Fixing that is going to be a huge problem. Fixing issues in terms of retreat, major retrofit, protecting people, will require its own standards and guidelines, incentives and resourcing. These aren't things which are automatically on the table in many local councils. We have a big challenge with housing objectives. There's a huge dominant set of objectives around affordability and availability. And we have parts of the industry, not all, but parts will argue that increasing resilience in housing increases costs and excludes people from the property market. The government therefore does not get behind it. But we also know that resilience in housing is not taken into account in decision making. We have insurance that doesn't incentivise risk reduction, and we don't yet have a proper national approach to planning how we could possibly accommodate 45 million people in this country in the next few decades. We know more about risk. We know more about where sustainable water supplies might be. We know more about how we can connect with renewable energy. But how are we really designing Australia for 45 million people? We're not. The Planning Institute has long called for a national settlement strategy. So it does leave us in a complex space. It leaves local governments in a very complex space. There's tensions to be resolved. And this is also a long-term agenda. Taking action to build resilience by 2050 really means starting now. I know that soil was in the title of the update today, so I thought I needed to have a soil example. And I'd like to talk about contaminated soils and climate change. Australian soil for decades has been contaminated by all sorts of things, heavy metals, hydrocarbons, toxic organic compounds. asbestos, man-made chemicals. And there's an estimation that there's around 160,000 contaminated sites in Australia, with less than 10% of those remediated to date. The challenge is that climate change is now increasing the availability of contamination. And in a number of areas, we have what we can call as a ticking toxic time bomb. We've got about 50,000 abandoned mines in Australia, a bunch of them historically, say dealing with gold, dealt with a lot of arsenic and mercury. The tailings with high concentrations of arsenic and mercury are left on the surface of the soil. They're uncovered. More dust storms are moving that. Airborne mercury, airborne lead, airborne arsenic easily get into the food chain. They're breathed in. It's a health risk. We know that we've got many thousands of old petrol stations which have been capped, but the underground infrastructure is corroding, it's starting to leak, and we're getting plumes of things like benzene and xylene in groundwater. They're both very toxic chemicals. Increased rainfall intensity, increased flooding, raising groundwater levels in certain areas because of local flood events can cause those toxic chemicals to become more available and more widespread. We know there's about 2,000 old landfill sites in Australia, and old landfill sites are a concern because they do not have the protective lining. We're seeing increased rainfall events causing more leachate. That means all sorts of things. Forever chemicals, PFAS, heavy metals, asbestos, organic compounds can migrate into the ground and surface water. And we've got a number of examples where coastal erosion is actually bringing to the surface some quite toxic chemicals. One example, Port Fairy, landfill sites closed in 1998, but significant erosion has occurred. And we have, solutions to remediation, which sort of put the cost in the ballpark of 35 to 50 million if we take into account erosion and storm surge events likely to 2050. If you want a lasting solution, it's way beyond what the local council can afford. They've approved a rock wall for 1.1 million. They know it's a stopgap measure. They're approaching the state government. We have a big risk here, which we haven't even quantified. There's only very rough estimates of where these sites are, what their toxic compounds are. I should probably stop talking about this. And we need to shift from static to more dynamic measures. We need a lot more assessment of risk, and we need appropriate funding and the capacity for insurance. This is going to be hard work. So leaping onto trees, just to sort of lighten the tone a little bit. Urban greening is well known as a jolly good thing to help combat warming in cities, and a whole bunch of cities have done amazing works and have significant targets for urban greening. And the City of Sydney has a target to increase its tree canopy and has invested or has an investment plan for something like $370 million to invest to drive greening across the city. And benefits are quite significant, shade, shelter, residential comfort, improved air quality, resilience for the city. But something that's working counter to that in parts of the city is the heavy pruning of street trees by Ausgrid, the electricity distribution provider, to ensure safe clearances for the wires. And local residents are concerned. These are two pictures of Sydney streets affected by the heavy pruning. There is a solution to this, and Ausgrid in their 24 to 29 plan consulted with councils about many other things, but vegetation management and resilience, and agreed to propose aerial bundled cabling. Now, the ABC of cabling, aerial bundled cabling, basically means you put the cables together. They're not bare like this. They're insulated. They're more robust. They're safer. You can actually have ABC wiring in a tree canopy. It could save the tree canopies of Sydney. Ausgrid, as required, submitted its plan to the Australian Energy Regulator. The regulator takes responsibility for determining what's an appropriate investment. The regulator makes its decisions in accordance with national electricity rules. And the regulator's final decision was basically to reject the Ausgrid expenditure forecast and to allow up to about, I think it's about a third of the expenditure sought. And the rationale of the AER, the Australian Energy Regulator, is that the proposal did not demonstrate a causal link between the expenditure, the benefit to consumers, and the expected actually increase in resilience and the rationale in terms of extreme weather. AER argue that the investment did not have, therefore, the greatest net, prudent and efficient benefit to consumers. Now, it's important to note the AER is making decisions in accordance with the law. They have done the right thing. We also need to note that the National Electricity Law and Regulation were framed during the 1990s. It was a period of microeconomic reform that prioritised competition, economic efficiency and market operation. The regulatory system then that tests for investment is based on ensuring we have a net financial benefit for any investment made. And the guidance for the cost-benefit analysis is very strict. Only factors that relate to market operation can be taken into account, and those factors need to be quantified. So it's not surprising that things like avoided health costs don't factor into the decisions of the AER. It does raise a wider policy question, though, about how do we want to move forward. I think we need methods development. I think we need some policy review which sits above the regulator. I think we need regulatory reform in the context of a policy review. It's a much bigger question. But all of this links back to the capacity of the City of Sydney to take some decisions in its streets. We've got a local problem. We've got national regulation not designed for climate change. The adaptation agenda here is really quite complex. So really to wrap up, just thinking about that question of adaptation being hard, being multi-scale, and what do we need to start thinking about? I mean, in the 3 tiny snapshot case studies that I mentioned, we explored an example where effective adaptation required a real mix of policies across a whole range of sectors, insurance, building codes, across scales. It won't be effective if we do all of those things in isolation. We understand that we've got unplanned impacts emerging from climate change, like the exposure of toxic waste from a landfill site in Victoria. Funds need to be brought forward to accommodate that. I mean, this wasn't something that the council had budgeted for. We've got things going beyond the local capacity. And we also understand that sensible local partnerships need to find a way to work with national law, and sometimes that requires reform. So practically, we've learnt a lot about what we can do with incremental measures over the last 20 years. We've learnt a lot about what you can do with sort of low-cost interventions, and I think we're starting to learn that we actually need some bigger leadership in this space. So practically, I think it's time to put the bigger leadership question on the table. We need to find a way to value adaptation and value climate resilience in decision-making. Not a small thing, but we have an understanding that the costs of inaction are extremely high, and I think Mark in December referred to the cost of inaction for Australia being in the trillions. It is time the adaptation community actually started to come together. Let's find a way to move forward. Let's give ourselves a challenge to find a way to translate some of those big figures to net benefits for decision makers in sectors. It needs to be professionally and sectorally decision context relevant. And so I think a significant challenge then is to how do we professionalise our adaptation community to enable those discussions to happen in a professional and impactful and influential way. An Australian Society for Adaptation Professionals can actually help build the capacity of the sector. It can draw knowledge together. It can draw experience together with insights from First Nations peoples, with insights from the research community to start building tools on how we can move forward in decision approaches. It can mentor people and build the younger early career researcher and early professional skill sets. And it can set professional standards that make it clear that we need to go beyond incrementalism. So it is actually, I think, quite exciting to note that discussions have started on establishing an Australian Society for Adaptation Professionals in Australia. And I think Mark was instrumental in kicking off this idea, but there's a lot of important enthusiasm. And so if you're interested in this, please do keep in touch. And within that, as my final point, local governments will need to have a really important role in the connections with the community It can help us build the compelling case. What has worked? What's the level of community demand? What hasn't worked? What can we learn from that? How far can we learn from the limits of incrementalism, and how can we build the case for taking a step beyond that? And the local perspective is hugely important in that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jo Mummery, if you don't mind staying there. Yeah, it was a fascinating presentation. Lots of things that are not traditionally discussed, I would say, in adaptation discussion. How it relates to housing, urban environments in terms of street cables, and soil even. So climate change will not only affect us, human health from the exposure to high heat, but also the other effects that it brings, such as carrying contaminants to places where it's not originally formed at. Before we go to the panel discussion, I would like to invite questions on the presentation. If there's any from the audience who would like to ask a question. Yes, please. Can we... No, please wait. Sorry, thank you.
Thanks, Professor Jo. Wonderful presentation. And I was just reflecting on, say, my country context. I come from India, where in addition to immense challenges of climate change, we also have a development question. So local governments are often like really confused about where to put the money in. I work in adaptation, and in an area that was seeing successive floodings, we suggested eco-blocks, for example. They rejected it outright for being like too costly. So how do you see local governments kind of, aligning adaptation needs and future-proofing climate change infrastructure, along with like ensuring that they are also making sure that development goals are met? Just wanted to hear your insights around this. Thanks.
That's a really difficult question to answer. It underpins, I guess, so many issues concerned with how well, local governments are operating, the challenges in developing countries, which can be, very significant, and resource constraints, funding constraints, can be even deeper. Look, I think, we talked earlier in the day about the importance of communication and some clever ways of starting to think about, new technology and how can we possibly have communities that can start learning from each other? How can we also have ways to make sure that when an infrastructure intervention is made, that it doesn't just lead to adverse consequences to an adjacent region? And we're starting to see some of those challenges already in Australia. I'd like to pass it around the panel and see what other thoughts people have.
Sure, Jenny, would you like go ahead?
I'm going to pass that one on to Nicole. I think you've just, nailed the issue that local government is facing, really significant needs, and both in Australia and overseas. So there isn't an easy answer at all. It is extremely difficult. Climate change isn't going away. So, local governments and communities are having to respond to it. They're also just having to try to balance all the other needs that they have, and it's extremely difficult.
I think that's a nice, we'll get to the other questions, but it's a nice segue to the first question I had for the panel, which is about how to connect the national level policies and the local level policies. How is, maybe this is more to you, Nicole, but others feel free to answer. How is the Commonwealth supporting capacity building across jurisdictions, especially local governments?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So this audience probably knows that last year the Commonwealth released its National Climate Risk Assessment and National Adaptation Plan. The Climate Risk Assessment prepared by the Australian Climate Service, which is our premier science agencies, and the Adaptation Plan prepared by the Department of Climate Change, so where I work, as a internal to government product. What the Adaptation Plan does is it sets out the framework for Australian government action, taking action on adaptation. It sets out the things that the Australian government's already doing, and it outlines priorities going forward. There's probably two important things that this audience might be interested in knowing. One, and it's really a bit of a response to what Jo was saying, there's a real emphasis there in the Adaptation Plan on mainstreaming adaptation. So wherever we can spend in other portfolio areas, so wherever we're spending money, whether it's in health or whether it's in energy or environment or wherever it is, when we're doing that, trying to identify, trying to have climate change at the top of the mind so that those policy priorities in those other areas are actually delivered. So Jo highlighted that there can be conflict in policy priorities, and there can be, but there's not always. Some of the time, actually, you need to take climate change seriously, because if you don't, you're not going to be able to achieve your other, it's going to undermine your other policy priorities. So sometimes they do align, and one of the things that's really important for us to do, and our department is doing, is working with agencies to support them in just achieving their existing priorities. This isn't a new thing. Another thing you might be interested in hearing about is there's a commitment in the Adaptation Plan to an action agenda, and that is being developed with states and territories and with local government. So that's through the Energy and Climate Change Ministerial Council. There's a officials level working group underneath that called the Adaptation Working Group. It will drive a lot of that work. ALCA's part of that. That work is kicked off. There's a real focus there, I would say, on practical projects. So work is underway.
You know, anything? Yeah.
Look, I'm just going to take it straight off policy. I'm going to say I left a role in policy many years ago to go to the coalface to try and change things in the housing industry. And I'm a member of the NBA and the HIA, and I've lobbied and I've done all sorts of stuff. But I've boiled it down now to totally being applied and practical. And I spend most of my time communicating directly to people and helping them make their homes climate resilient. And I don't know if any of you are on Instagram, but I've got an account called Jen Lish Fix It Chicks. This is just one example that has 60,000 followers, mainly women. And we helped a truckload of people through the most recent heat wave. So I am really here today to stress the imperative of that communication directly to people. And there was a lot of discussion earlier about communicating the science, and yes, that's very important at one level, but on that platform where I'm having the biggest impact I think I've had in my career, I cut the science right out, and it's just about how to make your home safe, comfortable, get your kids to sleep through the night, and save some money. So comfort, health, and saving money. And it's having big cut through. So I'm now trying to work out how I talk to that audience about the fact that I've been here today, and it's all to do with climate change. But that's my tangent. I just wanted to get in early.
And could I just sort of reiterate a point I think I made in my presentation, that there's a whole range of links across scales when you think about adaptation in Australia, and the housing example I gave was one, but I think we're starting to see some of the work that's happening in Alga and some of the local councils, and it's really important that we start building the capacity for the local level to be able to articulate this is what they can do, and this is what they need, and their work will be more effective if the legislative frameworks are adjusted in this way. And I think that upwards communication needs to happen. There's an opportunity, Nicole has noted, there's an action plan being developed. Not that we want to inundate the federal government with everyone's ideas, but I think there needs to be clearly thought through articulations around where there might be a gap. And it's really important that the local level, which responds to communities, can articulate that well in an aggregated way. And I think that's actually quite powerful. There's work started there. There's great examples. There's great leadership examples which need to be scaled up. And in some cases, councils can afford it. In other cases, they can't. But we need to have a way to be able to pull together, those insights so that they can be understood at state levels and above.
Thank you. Can we explore more, Jenny, what you just mentioned now as your answer? In your work in communicating how climate change will impact communities' lives, what sort of approach you take there? How do you get through the community? Do you use digital platforms? Do you come to community meetings? What has been the most successful to you? It doesn't have to be one size fits all.
No.
It usually isn't.
That's right.
If you can give some examples.
Yeah, look, I've used all of those strategies. So I have, but now I'm focusing on using the mainstream media. So social media is a great way to get to an audience that we wouldn't otherwise get to. I'm also doing some work with TV production, Channel 9, 9 Life, an audience that is so different to the Grand Designs and the ABC audience. It's no point preaching to the converted. I've done a lot of work on ABC Radio and ABC TV, but I'm moving away from that. So this Channel 9 show is based on the people from the block. They're slowly modifying it in collaboration with CSIRO, based on social science research. We're trying to get these subtle messages through to people. So we've got to get creative. We don't want to slam people over the head with the science. We want to show them things they can do at home. Again, comfort, health, saving some money. We don't even necessarily have to associate it directly to the climate change, but we actually had a conference in Sydney earlier this year, a group of media people and climate scientists talking about how to do this. And there's a lot of people doing research in this area. So I've presented at conferences, I've done community events. They all are useful. And I encourage people to do whatever they feel comfortable doing. Any sort of communication will have some effect. But for me now, I have kind of given up on lobbying industry and policy. And I know there's good people still working in those areas, but for me it is down at the coalface directly to homeowners. And often that's the women. There is, I know Anne mentioned before that there's a tech bro issue in this space with people thinking that, PV system, batteries, double glazing, all the sexy, shiny stuff is the solution. It's not. There's much, much more basic stuff. One acronym, again, I'll leave this, that I want to leave with you, DIG, and that stands for draft seal, insulate, and get off gas. We can do that in every Australian house. Will make a huge impact on our health costs as well as our energy use.
Thank you. We'll add that to the glossary. I would like now to invite any questions from the audience. There's one high up there. Do you have the microphone? Yeah, I'll get to the online question as well.
Firstly, I've got a quick question for Jo, and that is, thanks for pointing out the benefits of aerial bundling of cables. Now, intuitively, I would think that would apply certainly to local distribution cabling, but intuitively, I'm inclined to think that at the voltages involved in higher level transmission, that is not yet a practicable solution. Are you able to confirm that?
Oh, look, I think that's right. I mean, I was talking very much about the sort of cables which interact with street canopy. So they're low voltage wires. And they're the ones which tend to be a challenge for street trees. So I fully agree. I think the high voltage bigger infrastructure is a different kettle of fish.
Well, it would solve problems in that area if the technical issues could be resolved, but it's clearly a inherently bigger problem. Thank you. But the next point I'd make in relation to urban tree cover, we've got a particular problem in the ACT and I believe nationally, and I think the elephant in the room is the capital gains tax exemption for the principal place of residence, and that incentivises building of McMansions, and I think it's about time governments took the bull by the horns in that area, and I think planning authorities could use pricing mechanisms to resolve the problem of not so much reducing the individual's power of choice, but to disincentivise overbuilding and make a better case for their individual needs being met, like, for example, having blended families living or extended families living under the same roof and that sort of thing. But
you're preaching to the converted with me here, and I think everyone here would largely agree. Look, size, footprint of houses is the big elephant in the room in the housing industry. Nobody bloody well wants to talk about it except me. I will at every conference get up there and bang on about house size and poor design and how smaller footprint homes can work so effectively and co-living, and my business has done examples of that here in Canberra, lots of examples of that, but my level of frustration is so high now that I have closed the architecture side of my business to move solely to retrofitting and adapting existing buildings. So we really have to get that into our heads too. Clearly, the new stuff we do needs to be a lot better. There also needs to be a lot less of it. There are a lot of existing buildings that can be adapted, and the industry is so reluctant, it drives me insane. So don't forget that when we talk about housing and buildings. Using what we've got already should be a big push. But
yeah, thank you. Do you have anything? So we have online question as well. Yeah.
And I'm conscious of time. Stephen from online asked a question at the very beginning of today, and I'm going to wrap it into another question from someone else. So Stephen asked this morning about integrating social science or behavioural science into advisory committees, particularly maybe in policy and government, that seem to sometimes rely on the technical science. So we heard a little bit about that. I'm conscious that on the panel, we have academia, advocacy and policy represented. And so another question I think that would help to wrap us up in all of our learnings today is how can we all work together? So, noting that some people prefer to work at the coalface, some in policy, and how can we demonstrate, particularly to local communities across Australia, how they can be involved and work with professionals and researchers across the country to discuss and act on climate change.
Okay, two big questions. We may start up with Nicole, whichever you prefer to answer first.
So one thing that is extremely helpful for government is very short and straight to the point arguments. So I suppose I would say to the degree that researchers are interacting with government, just like all of us, we all get many emails, but certainly within government, there's limited ability to navigate through all of those. So that communications piece of just one idea and really sell it is really helpful.
Do you have any response to integrating social scientists in processes to decide on policies?
So we do have within DQ a behavioural science area. It is reasonably early days, I'd say. So in the sense, yeah, so reasonably early days. So it's sort of mainly focused on things like what's the nature of the letters that you might send out to the I don't know, bill payers or that sort of thing. Yeah, so definitely opportunity for more there.
And yes.
Could I just do a thumbs up to Stephen? I think it's a really important point. Look, I think, the government does have mechanisms to consult with, a wide range of bodies and tends to set up committees with a breadth of expertise on them. But I think we do have gaps in a range of professional sectors where we need to push this a lot more. And, we keep talking about housing, and I'd say there's examples in housing where I don't think, we have enough social researchers and community voices on committees that make decisions about changes to standards. I think we need to start changing that. There's some quite good work, I think, in the engineering community, and Engineers Australia is a bit progressive. The Planning Institute's quite progressive, but connecting people with those skills into, some of the decision-making advisory committees, around how we're changing a big bit of infrastructure or something, I think we've got a way to go. It's important. And I just sort of note that a lot of adaptation actually comes down to how people behave, the institutions in which we work, politics. And if you don't have a social perspective on that, science is not going to connect and resonate.
Thank you very much, our panelists. I think that leaves us a lot of examples and experience and hope for the future. There's a lot to be done, but we have some experiences that have been successful. We know where we need to close the gaps. So the panelists are here if you want to catch them for your additional questions. But I would like to please join me in thanking the panelists. And thank you for your engagement.
Oh, I'm just going to say a couple of things to close. Sorry. Yes, no, it's good. So obviously, some concerning data presented by Sarah and also in the discussion with Mark this morning, hugely concerning. And, I'm part of the IPCC's processes as well, and was reviewing the use of integrated assessment modelling as it kind of kicked off in the 90s to think about climate projections, what the implications might be for temperature. Those were projections based on modelling. And now, the important thing I think to note about a lot of the information that Sarah presented is, this is real data. So this is actually observations which are being drawn from around the world, which are demonstrating that a lot of the concerns expressed in that early modelling were exactly right. So hugely concerning. One of the things that we obviously wanted to do with this event, and in general, actually, at the Institute, is also to think about what we might do. I work in the energy transition space, and obviously, in terms of energy transition, things are too late and too slow. But one of the things that really, can help you go to work every day and feel hopeful is it's also the case that every molecule that's mitigated matters in terms of final outcomes for the environment and also for human societies. And I think that's also the case here. And one of the things we really wanted to bring to you today, there's an enormous amount of work to be done in the adaptation space. And all of that work is going to matter enormously, given the nature of the data that was presented in the first session. The other point that I've taken away from the session is that we need a lot of governance and institution building around solving the adaptation problem, while also recognising some things we're not going to be able to adapt to, and we need to mitigate as quickly as we possibly can. So hopefully today has been instructive for you. Also some notes of hope, or certainly where you might put your shoulder to the wheel in order to move forward, to work at the coalface. And I always try and avoid using coalface as my metaphor, and I haven't come up with another good one. But yeah, absolutely. Shifting ideation to action in terms of work. A few people to thank. Firstly, thanks to all of you Also to those who are listening in online for your attention and for supporting the work of the Institute, the work at the ANU, and the work obviously of others who are in the space, incredibly important. And it will continue to be so. I'd like to thank the speakers, Sarah, Mark, Johanna, Anna, Jason, Jo, Nicole, and Jenny. Thanks particularly to Nicole for coming across from the Department of Climate Change, Energy, Environment, and Water and participating in the discussion. Really appreciate that. Adaptation is going to be a key focus for what we do in 2026 and beyond. Thanks to our moderators. Really importantly, thanks to the iCED's comms team and also the Canberra staff for their support for this. I kind of came back in, I've been running around in lots of different places and came back in and everything just absolute clockwork, and it's just terrific. And if you could join me in just thanking everybody for enabling that happen. Lastly, a couple of things. Firstly, in terms of iCEDs, if you want to engage with us, I think there's a QR code popping up somewhere. I love these QR codes, but there you go. One of the things that we do is run energy essentials and climate essentials programs at very reasonable cost. And these are made available to help make the best science available to you around mitigation and around adaptation to help communicate the kinds of messages that we're giving you today, but also with deeper sectoral deep dives and so on and so forth. If you scan those codes, you can learn all about those, and we welcome your engagement on those. And then lastly, if you have any feedback on this update, what you'd like to see in the future, for example, if you'd like to see us do a full day rather than a half day, all sorts of ideas are welcome. And there's another very large QR code there. Really encourage you to do that. When we teach, we always say to students, please fill out the student experience surveys because they really help us a lot in forward planning to understand what you all want. So strongly encourage you to do that. The videos, if you don't capture this now, from this event will be available on the iCED's YouTube channel over the next few days. So if you want to rediscover some of the content, look at some of the presentations again, download some of these presentations, they'll be available for you. So again, thanks for your attention. Thanks for your engagement. We look forward to seeing you at the program.